The Winstead estate had always loomed like a forgotten relic, its weathered boards sagging under the weight of a century's secrets. Locals claimed the house had a presence, a coldness that seeped into your bones if you lingered too long at its gates. When I arrived, the air itself seemed thick, as if it resisted intrusion. The sons of the family greeted me at the door, tall, identical in manner, yet distinct in some ineffable way, their eyes glinting with a knowledge that made my stomach tighten. And then they spoke. The historian had always been drawn to stories that lingered on the edge of disbelief, tales whispered in taverns and small-town diners about families whose legacies were older and stranger than the land they occupied. The Winstead estate was one of those stories, a place avoided by locals, half hidden beneath the weight of towering oaks and creeping ivy. Its silhouette, weathered and uneven, rose from the ground like a shadow that refused to be dispelled, each gabled roof and shuttered window hinting at secrets long sealed behind closed doors. As he approached, the road narrowed into a gravel path, littered with fallen leaves that crunched beneath his boots in a sound that seemed almost too loud, too conscious, echoing in the surrounding woods. The wind carried a strange chill, tugging at the edges of his coat and whispering through the branches like a cautionary voice. Every instinct screamed that he should turn back, that curiosity here was a dangerous companion. But the historian pressed forward, driven by an insatiable desire to witness and understand what the rest of the world feared. The estate's gates loomed before him, wrought iron curling into designs that were elegant yet unervingly intricate, each twist and spike shaped like the talons of some unseen creature. They were unlocked, swaying slightly in the wind as though expecting him, inviting him into a world that had not been disturbed for decades. The path beyond twisted, lined with gnarled trees whose limbs arched overhead like the bony fingers of some giant, watching him as he walked. Moss covered the edges of the stones beneath his feet, softening each step, yet giving off a faint, musty smell that spoke of decay and time unmoved. The house itself seemed to inhale as he named closer, the windows reflecting the gray sky above in fractured glimmers, as if observing him in return. Upon reaching the front door, he paused, hand on the weathered brass handle, feeling the slight vibration beneath his fingers, a subtle hum that ran through the wood into his arm. The air seemed heavier here, dense with expectation and something else, something almost imperceptible, a lingering sense of presence that made the hairs along his neck rise. When he finally pushed the door open, it groaned like a living thing, protesting his intrusion with a sound that echoed through the empty halls. Inside, dust motes hung in the air, caught in shafts of dim light that managed to pierce the grimy windows, illuminating the edges of furniture long forgotten. The historian stepped across the threshold, aware with every heartbeat that he was no longer merely a visitor to an abandoned house, but an intruder in a domain that had shaped its inhabitants in ways no outsider could predict, and that the estate itself was aware of him in a manner that was unsettlingly intimate. The first time he saw the Winstead sons, the historian felt a cold knot of unease coil in his stomach. They appeared in the main hall as if summoned by his arrival, emerging from shadowed corridors with a precision and grace that was almost unnatural. Each of them was tall, their postures rigid yet fluid, moving with a quiet certainty that suggested they had spent their entire lives in synchronization with one another and with the house itself. Their faces shared striking similarities. High cheekbones, sharp eyes that reflected a light too steady to be merely human, and mouths that curled into expressions that were almost smiles, but held an edge that hinted at something darker. They did not speak immediately, simply observing him in silence, the weight of their gaze pressing like a physical force. It was impossible to determine how many there were at first, for their movements were so precise that it seemed they were duplicating one another in an uncanny rhythm. Then the sound came. It was not a language he had ever heard, nor any dialect that could be traced through known records. The sons spoke in unison and separately, their voices overlapping, weaving a complex tapestry of sound that was melodic yet chilling. It was as though the air itself vibrated with their words, each syllable carrying a resonance that settled into the bones. The cadence of the speech was hypnotic, rising and falling like the swell of a tide, and though it had no recognizable meaning, it communicated intent and purpose, a strange coherence that defied his understanding. Attempts to mimic the sound failed instantly, his tongue fumbling against shapes it could not form, his ears straining to catch even fragments that might offer a clue. There was a rhythm to their communication that suggested a language alive, not static, one that seemed to shift depending on his presence and reactions. At times, it felt like the room itself was participating, the wooden beams subtly vibrating, the shadows dancing in response to the pitch and tone of the sun's utterances. The historian realized that this was not merely speech, but a form of interaction with the house, an unbroken connection between the sons and something unseen that permeated every corner of the estate. Despite his growing unease, the historian attempted to respond, offering words in English, explanations, questions, anything that might bridge the gap. The sons tilted their heads in unison, their expressions unchanged, and continued their strange dialogue, seemingly unaffected by his presence yet entirely aware of him. In that moment, he understood that he had entered a realm governed by rules entirely foreign, where communication was not a simple exchange of information but a ritual, a living bond that tied the Winstead family together in ways that human minds could scarcely comprehend, and that the true depth of what he had encountered was only beginning to reveal itself. The discovery of the journals came unexpectedly, hidden behind a false panel in the library that had gone unnoticed for decades. The historian's fingers traced the edges of the wood, feeling the slight hollow that gave way with a soft click. He pulled the panel open and revealed a small stack of books, their leather covers cracked and flaking, the scent of age and mildew rising in the dim light. Each journal was bound in a similar manner, yet none bore titles, dates, or author names. Opening the first one, he found pages filled with symbols and characters unlike any alphabet he had studied. They twisted and curled in intricate patterns, sometimes forming geometric shapes, other times flowing in lines that seemed to dance across the page. The handwriting, if it could be called that, was precise, almost obsessive, as though the person who had written it had dedicated their life to this strange script. The historian ran his hands over the text, feeling the weight of countless hours embedded in each stroke. The pages occasionally contained sketches, small drawings that mirrored the symbols, depicting ritualistic scenes of gatherings in candlelit rooms, strange artifacts, and figures with elongated limbs or obscured faces. There were also maps of the estate, detailed down to the positioning of furniture, doors, and hidden compartments, as if the house itself was a character in a story only the family could interpret. He sensed a deliberate attempt to encode knowledge, to safeguard something profound, something forbidden. Each journal felt like a key to a secret that resisted full understanding, offering glimpses of a reality he was not meant to comprehend fully. As he flipped through more journals, a pattern emerged. Certain symbols repeated at intervals, and clusters of the characters seemed to correspond to sounds he had heard from the son's language. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. The journals were a guide, a written form of the same incomprehensible speech that had met him when he first encountered the sons. It was as if the house and its inhabitants existed within a single, living language, one that could be spoken, written, and perhaps even invoked to produce effects beyond ordinary perception. The historian felt both awe and fear, recognizing that he was standing on the edge of knowledge humans had never meant to grasp, facing a codified connection between the Winstead sons and forces far older than the estate itself. Late into the evening, as shadows lengthened and the wind whispered through broken windows, he noticed that the journals seemed to exert a subtle pull, drawing his eyes to specific passages again and again. Words that should have been meaningless began to resonate faintly, as though the act of reading awakened something dormant. The historian realized with mounting dread that these journals were not merely records. They were instruments, conduits of a dark intelligence that had been cultivated for generations, and that his intrusion into their pages was not accidental but perhaps anticipated, a test of whether he could endure the reality that the Winstead sons had been guarding all along. From the moment he began studying the journals, the historian noticed subtle changes in the house itself, phenomena that defied rational explanation yet were impossible to ignore. Objects that had been still for decades shifted slightly when he turned his back, chairs tilted at impossible angles, and books that had been stacked neatly on shelves were found scattered across the floor as if moved by unseen hands. At first, he dismissed these incidents as the quirks of an old house settling. But the frequency and precision of the disturbances soon made him question his own perception. Shadows lengthened in corners where no light should reach, pooling like living ink on the walls, and the flicker of candlelight often revealed shapes that vanished when he tried to focus on them. A cold draft would snake through rooms even when doors and windows were firmly closed, carrying faint whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. The suns themselves appeared to be both the source and the observers of these disturbances. Their language, still incomprehensible to him, often filled the rooms during these strange episodes, rising and falling in a rhythm that made the air vibrate with an almost tangible energy. Sometimes, it felt as if the house responded to their voices, objects quivering in sync with the cadence of their speech, the floorboards subtly vibrating beneath his feet. The historian found that the longer he lingered, the more the house seemed to breathe, inhaling his presence and exhaling an invisible tension that clung to his skin and settled in his chest. He attempted to document the occurrences, taking notes and photographs, but cameras failed to capture the anomalies fully, leaving only blurred shapes and faint shadows. The more he tried to understand, the less sense it seemed to make, as if the house and its sons existed in a layer of reality slightly offset from his own. At night, the whispers grew louder, echoing down the empty halls and syllables that sometimes mirrored the strange patterns from the journals. It was during these hours that he felt the most unnerving sensation, the unmistakable impression that he was being watched, not merely by eyes, but by intelligence, by something patient and calculating, as if the estate itself had been aware of his every move long before he arrived. One evening, while exploring the attic, he stumbled upon a collection of mirrors, each coated in a thin layer of dust, reflecting distorted images of himself that seemed to twitch independently of his movements. At the same time, the sun's chant echoed faintly from below, unbroken and constant, as though they were communicating with forces hidden in the very fabric of the house. It became increasingly clear that the phenomena were not random. They were deliberate, extensions of the sun's language and will, expressions of a consciousness he could not comprehend. The historian realized with growing apprehension that the estate was not merely a setting for their lives, but an active participant in them, a vessel for the same dark, enigmatic force that had shaped the Winstead family for generations, and that each creak, flicker, and whisper was a warning, a signal, or perhaps a test of how far an outsider could intrude into a world that had been carefully sealed from human understanding. The historian had assumed that the remoteness of the Winstead estate meant isolation from the nearby town. Yet as he ventured into the village to gather supplies, he quickly discovered that the local population regarded the estate with a mixture of fear and reverence. He entered the general store, a small, dimly lit building lined with wooden shelves, and casually asked about the Winstead family, expecting a few hushed remarks or polite evasions. Instead, the shopkeeper froze mid-motion, eyes darting nervously toward the cracked window that faced the road to the estate. "You don't want to go there," the man said, voice low, almost trembling, and then quickly added, "Nobody who goes there comes back the same." The historian pressed for more details, but the townsfolk's reluctance was palpable, a wall of collective unease that seemed to thicken the air itself. Over the following days, he spoke quietly to those willing to share stories. Each account was fragmentary, almost dreamlike, yet all converged on a common theme. The Winsteads were different, and the son's language was dangerous. One elderly woman, her hands shaking as she clutched a worn shawl, recounted how she had once heard the family speaking from the estate, and even from a distance, the sounds had unsettled her. The words had twisted her thoughts, she said, filling her mind with images she could not explain, leaving a lingering sense of dread that lasted for weeks. Another man spoke of his brother, a curious young man who had attempted to observe the estate from the edge of the woods and had returned incoherent, muttering fragments of speech that resembled the son's language, yet carried an intensity that terrified him. The historian began to understand that the townspeople did not merely fear the Winsteads. They seemed to regard them as a force beyond comprehension, a family whose influence could extend beyond the boundaries of the estate itself. There were whispered legends that any outsider who tried to learn the language or probed too deeply into the family's rituals either disappeared entirely or returned irrevocably altered, haunted by visions that no one could interpret. Some described neighbors who had laughed at the warnings, only to vanish without a trace, leaving their homes abandoned and doors swinging open as if the house itself had claimed them. The warnings grew more specific over time. One shopkeeper mentioned the rhythm, a term the historian did not understand, but it seemed to refer to the cadence of the son's speech and its effect on the mind. Another villager claimed that even hearing a fragment of the language could open the doors to things that humans were not meant to know. The historian felt the weight of their collective fear, a tangible pressure pressing against him, as if the town itself was attempting to shield him from the unknown. Despite his scholarly curiosity, a shiver of doubt crept over him, and he realized that the warnings were not superstitions. They were lived experience, the memory of generations who had glimpsed something so dark and incomprehensible that survival required silence and avoidance. It became clear that every story, every hushed voice, was a cautionary thread woven into the very fabric of the town, a tapestry of dread built to prepare any outsider for what they might encounter if they entered the estate unprepared. Determined to understand the language of the Winstead sons, the historian began a meticulous process of recording every word, every syllable, every nuance of their speech. He set up notebooks, audio equipment, and even rudimentary transcription tools, hoping to find a pattern, a key to unlock the incomprehensible. At first, it seemed impossible. The language resisted every attempt at analysis, twisting and shifting in ways that defied conventional rules of syntax and phonetics. When he slowed down the recordings, he discovered tones and inflections that were imperceptible in real time, subtle variations that seemed almost musical, layered atop each other in complex rhythms that made his head ache. Every attempt to isolate words or assign meanings ended in frustration, as the language appeared to reshape itself when he focused on it, almost aware of his scrutiny, adapting in real time to maintain its impenetrability. He tried comparing the speech to every known language he had studied, ancient and modern, regional dialects, and even extinct scripts, but nothing matched. There were patterns, repetitions, and structures, but they were alien, almost as if the language existed on a different plane of perception entirely. Sometimes, when the sons spoke in unison, it felt like the walls themselves hummed in response, vibrating subtly beneath his fingers as if the house were amplifying or resonating with the sound. He began to notice small physical reactions in himself: dizziness, chills, the strange sensation that his own thoughts were being rearranged without his consent. It became clear that listening to them was not a neutral act. The language exerted influence, bending attention and perception, shaping awareness in ways that were deeply unsettling. In moments of isolation, he attempted to reproduce the sounds himself, speaking aloud the fragments he had recorded. Immediately, the room seemed to respond. The shadows deepened, the temperature dropped, and a faint vibration ran through the floorboards. Even the sons paused, their eyes glinting with an intensity that made him feel both scrutinized and warned. Each attempt to mimic the language felt dangerous, as though he were reaching towards something meant to remain beyond human understanding. He realized that the language was not merely a tool for communication. It was a form of interaction with the estate itself, an active conduit to forces embedded in the very structure of the house and the family. Over time, the historian began to notice patterns that suggested intent rather than randomness. Certain sequences of sounds corresponded to changes in the house: the flicker of candlelight, the subtle movement of shadows, the whispering of air through cracks in the walls. It was as though the language was alive, not simply conveying meaning, but commanding responses from the environment and perhaps even from the listener. Every new discovery brought both exhilaration and a deepening dread, as he realized that the more he understood, the more he risked becoming entangled in a network of influence and perception far beyond the limits of ordinary human experience, and that the son's incomprehensible language was not merely a secret to decode, but a force to endure. The hidden cellar revealed itself as a place that seemed to have been deliberately erased from memory, a part of the estate that existed in shadow and secrecy. The historian discovered it behind a loose section of the kitchen floor, a panel that had resisted casual inspection for decades. Pulling it aside revealed a narrow staircase leading downward, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and centuries of neglect. Each step creaked under his weight, echoing in the confined space like a whispered warning. When he reached the bottom, he found a low-ceilinged chamber carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house, its walls covered in strange, intricate carvings that seemed to shift slightly when caught in the corner of his eye. Symbols twisted and curved in patterns that suggested movement, as if the stone itself were alive with a silent, deliberate language. The floor was covered in objects whose purpose was immediately unsettling. Small statues of unknown origin, their features grotesque and exaggerated, stood in uneven rows. Bowls filled with hardened residues of substances he could not identify were arranged in geometric patterns. Candles, long since burned to stubs, were scattered haphazardly, but suggested careful placement for rituals that had not been interrupted in a controlled manner for generations. The centerpiece of the room was a mural painted directly onto the stone, a sprawling, nightmarish depiction of a figure both human and impossible, limbs elongated, eyes hollow, and posture commanding as if overseeing the entire estate above. Around the figure, smaller forms appeared to writhe and contort, connected by lines and symbols that mirrored those he had seen in the journals and heard in the son's language. As he moved closer to examine the mural, he realized that the very air in the cellar seemed to respond to the presence of the symbols. The whispers of the son's language, faint but unmistakable, seemed to rise from the walls themselves, echoing through the chamber with a clarity that was almost hypnotic. The historian felt a deep, instinctive recognition, a shiver of terror and awe, as though the room were alive, listening, and waiting. He understood that the language was not limited to the son's mouths. It was etched into stone, encoded in relics, and woven into the physical structure of the estate itself. The room's arrangement suggested careful orchestration, a system designed to amplify and channel forces beyond ordinary perception. The carvings, mural, and artifacts formed a network of intent, a ritualistic lattice that seemed designed to communicate, to call, or perhaps to summon. Each detail resonated with the incomprehensible speech of the Winstead sons, and he began to perceive subtle connections. The rhythm of their voices matched the curves of the carvings, and certain phrases seemed to align with symbols on the floor. It became clear that the cellar was not merely a storage space or a secret room. It was the heart of the estate's power, a repository of knowledge and force that had been cultivated over generations, and that the son's language was not simply spoken for communication, but was intrinsically linked to the very essence of what lay beneath the house. The first disappearance occurred in a way that made the historian question the fragile boundary between reality and the estate's influence. One of his guides, a local man who had reluctantly agreed to accompany him through the woods surrounding the Winstead property, had been fascinated by the language and the journals, claiming he could almost understand fragments of it. Late one evening, as the wind rattled the skeletal branches against the windows and the house seemed to inhale with a slow, deliberate rhythm, the guide insisted on wandering down into the cellar alone. He muttered about patterns in the carvings, about a pulse he could feel in the walls, and though the historian tried to dissuade him, the man's determination was unwavering, driven by a reckless curiosity that bordered on obsession. Minutes turned into hours with no sign of him. The historian waited at the top of the stairs, the house pressing in from all sides, shadows pooling unnaturally in corners as though aware of the missing presence. He called out, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration, but only the faint echo of his own words returned. When he finally descended into the cellar, he found the room empty, the symbols and artifacts undisturbed, yet the air felt charged, almost electric, as though the absence itself carried weight. There were subtle signs, small disturbances, an overturned candle, a faint footprint in the dust, a whisper that seemed to curl around the stone walls, indicating that something had occurred that he could not comprehend. In the following hours, the historian scoured the estate, retracing every step of the guide's path, examining hidden alcoves, passages, and stairways that had previously gone unnoticed. Nothing was found, yet the sensation of being watched grew, heavier and more oppressive than before. It was during this search that he began to notice the changes more acutely. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, the air thickened with an almost tactile pressure, and the faint cadence of the sun's language seemed to echo through the halls even when no one spoke. The guide's disappearance was not merely a matter of physical absence. It was a shift in the environment, a disturbance in the rhythm of the house itself. The historian realized that the sun's language, which he had been attempting to decode, was not harmless. It interacted with the estate in ways that humans could neither predict nor control. The longer the guide had listened, the more vulnerable he became to its influence. The air seemed to hum with a resonance that aligned with the hidden lattice of carvings, artifacts, and murals the historian had discovered, as though the house had accepted the guide as a participant in something ancient and inexorable. The historian's unease grew with the understanding that the estate, the language, and the suns were entwined in a network of power that did not merely observe outsiders but could claim them, erase them, or transform them into extensions of the family's dark legacy, leaving behind nothing tangible but a lingering echo of what had been lost. The confrontation with the Winstead sons came after weeks of growing tension, a moment the historian had both anticipated and feared. He had watched the patterns in their language, traced the echoes of their speech through the walls, and pieced together fragments from the journals, yet the deeper he delved, the more distant comprehension became. That evening, he decided to confront them directly, entering the main hall with a mixture of determination and dread. The sons were already there, standing in a semicircle, their expressions unreadable, their eyes glinting with a sharp intelligence that made him feel exposed. When he demanded answers, their heads tilted in unison, their gazes fixing on him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Then they began to speak. The language, as always, was unfamiliar, yet this time it carried a new force, a hypnotic cadence that wrapped around his mind like a tightening spiral. Each syllable seemed layered with meaning, and though he could not translate the words, he felt their intent as if it pressed against his consciousness. The historian struggled to maintain his grasp on reality, but visions began to flood his mind. Twisted landscapes, shadowed rituals, and fragments of history that had been deliberately erased from human memory. The sun's chant seemed to pull him into a space between the present and something far older, where time bent and the laws of reason no longer applied. As he forced himself to focus, he recognized glimpses of the estate's past, generations of Winsteads engaging in rites that tied them to forces beyond comprehension, each son trained from birth in this living language, each utterance a thread woven into the house's pulse. The historian realized that what he had been attempting to study as a language was not meant for human understanding. It was a vessel for something far older, a conduit for a consciousness that extended through the family, the house, and the very air around them. Attempting to grasp it fully risked more than confusion. It risked losing the self entirely. The sons paused briefly, and in that moment the historian felt the weight of the estate upon him, as though the walls themselves had been listening for years, waiting for an outsider bold or foolish enough to demand answers. The silence was thick, oppressive, pregnant with anticipation, and he sensed that the sons were aware of the choice he faced: retreat and survive with fragments of knowledge, or continue pressing for understanding and risk becoming part of the dark legacy himself. Their language resumed, faster now, sharper, weaving visions and whispers into an overwhelming tapestry that tested the limits of perception. He understood then that the confrontation was not simply about questions and answers. It was an initiation, a trial imposed by the sons and the house alike. A moment when human will met forces that had been cultivated for centuries, and the outcome depended not on reason, but on endurance, caution, and the capacity to survive a reality that no ordinary mind could contain. The historian's realization of the true nature of the Winstead sons' language came slowly, a creeping awareness that clawed at the edges of his mind until it became impossible to ignore. The fragments he had recorded, the patterns he had traced, and the visions induced by the cellar's murals all pointed toward a terrifying truth. The language was not a tool for human communication. It existed outside comprehension, a living conduit connecting the family to something ancient, something that had long slumbered beneath the estate, waiting for voices that could channel it. The longer he listened, the more he felt his own perception bending, reality shifting in subtle ways. Shadows no longer fell predictably, echoes returned distorted, and even the rhythm of his heartbeat seemed to sync with the cadence of the sun's speech. He understood, with a growing chill, that anyone who fully comprehended the language risked more than confusion or fear. It was a force designed to reshape the mind, to draw the listener into the same lattice of influence that bound the Winstead family across generations. Those who heard it in full were not merely informed. They were transformed, their thoughts and perceptions rewired, their humanity slowly eroded. The historian reflected on the townsfolk's warnings, the stories of disappearances, of altered minds, and the guide who had vanished in the cellar, and the pattern became horrifyingly clear. The language acted as both a key and a snare, opening doors to a realm where human consciousness was a fragile vessel, unable to withstand the weight of knowledge that had been cultivated for centuries. As he observed the sons, standing in the main hall and speaking in the incomprehensible rhythm that had haunted him since his arrival, he began to perceive the full scope of their existence. They were not simply a family. They were living instruments, their minds attuned to the currents of a force that extended through the house, through the estate, through time itself. Their speech was the medium, the ritual, and the bridge, and anyone outside the family could never hope to control it. They could only endure or be consumed. The realization was suffocating. Every attempt at understanding, every effort to decipher the words, was a step closer to losing the self, to being absorbed into a legacy older and darker than any human institution. The historian saw it in his own reactions, a sense of inevitability, a pull toward the language that resisted his attempts to maintain rational distance. Even now, as he recorded observations, he could feel the tendrils of influence curling into his thoughts, probing, testing, enticing. He understood that comprehension itself was a trap. Curiosity was a vulnerability. The sun's voices, the house's pulse, the language alive in the walls, all conspired to draw outsiders into a destiny that was neither accidental nor negotiable. Those who fully heard it did not simply learn. It claimed them, reshaped them, and made them part of something far older than themselves, a dark inheritance that no human mind could fully endure, a truth that was as intoxicating as it was terrifying, and that the historian now realized he had glimpsed, but at the peril of everything he thought he knew.